So, a thought that crossed my mind semi-recently that I actually think really encapsulates one of the biggest problems that Warframe currently has is an analogy towards Pokemon. So, there's a Pokemon called Shedinja, and for those of you who do not know, Shedinja is a unique special case among Pokemon in that it only has 1 HP. This, however, is circumvented by the fact that it has a special ability called Wonder Guard. Now, Wonder Guard means that only moves that are super effective against it will do damage to it. And it's been kind of a joke, kind of a meme, gimmick Pokemon, if you will. But more so on how this ties into Warframe is I think that every Warframe, for the most part, is basically Shedinja. In that the values of our health, our shields, simply don't matter. Now, one of the ways that Shedinja deals with its own problem is it has a item called the Focus Sash, meaning that it allows you to survive any hit once with 1 HP. Sounds kind of like shield gating. And it also has a move called Recycle, which allows it to reset that Focus Sash if it needs to. But, moreover, I think that this really is kind of the encapsulation of the survivability issues that we've been having as of late. Primarily having to do with that every Warframe kind of functions on that same wavelength of, if you will, for the most part. There are a couple exceptions, you know, obviously, you know, Revenant, Nyx, so on and so forth, but, like, if you're not part of that club, you are always walking that thin tightrope of, oh, well, you can take 1 hit before you die, and that really, you can't really do much else about that past a certain point. I mean, again, obviously, lower-level missions, you know, that's not necessarily the case, but you get to a certain point, and that certain point is becoming more and more accessible to more and more players, where you shield gate or you die. And that is it. And that is how we live. We are either invincible or we're not. Our health bars are on and off switches. For the most part. And I think that that is one of the most pervasive issues that... First of all, I think that they are much too afraid of giving us forms of damage reduction. Adaptation is fine. That was introduced way back when arbitrations were brought into the game, before Steel Path even existed. And that has been about the only form of widely accessible damage reduction that we've had that isn't a helmet ability. And I think that that is something that, if we want to solve that problem, that does need to change. Because I think if you introduce a secondary accessible form of damage reduction, I think that, for one, health tanks actually become much, 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 much better. In that it actually lets them utilize their HP bar more effectively. Because having that one extra source of damage reduction really kind of does feel like the difference between, oh, I'm going to get one shot at level 5,000 versus, oh, I can actually go the distance. Speaking from personal experience. Now, again, obviously, the other solution to this is that they could curb or adjust enemy damage numbers, but as we continue going forward, I don't feel like they're going to do that. Because, one, I think that Pablo actually did really have a point with this, where, oh, if we fiddle with that, it throws off the balance of all of the Warframe survivability, and completely throws it just out of whack entirely. And I think that that is a valid thing to be concerned about, you know, having to rebalance the entire roster's survivability levels after adjusting enemy damages would not be a good idea. So I think that the only way to do this moving forward is just give the players more tools to where having to ride the knife's edge of shield gating is not so much of a requirement. And I think that that's kind of the best case scenario for it. Like I said, though, there is the flip side of this thing where if you balance it, or if you don't balance it enough, then, okay, now we have invincible Warframes. Shedinja, going back to this analogy, is very infamous for having in secondary formats like was it Hackmons, if you're familiar with that, where they are given custom stats and abilities and types and whatever, and people will give Shedinja a type combination that has no weakness, effectively making it invincible outside of entry hazards or other extraneous damage sources, as that has kind of been traditionally one of the things that has kept Shedinja out of most metagames. So I do think that that is something to be concerned about, is that if we don't handle this carefully, if we push too far in the other direction, okay, well then damage doesn't matter, right? There does need to be this struck balance between the two, where, we're not invincible, but we're not getting one shot either. And I really do think that we are just one, nice damage reduction tool away from having that be more realistic. But generally speaking, shield gating is just one of my biggest problems I think that I believe the game has currently. And I think that if that resolves, the game becomes much better for it, because frames don't have to stress as much about, doing backflips and somersaults to survive. Metaphorically speaking, not literally. But moreover, I think that if they do end up changing enemy damage numbers, I think the only realistic way to do it is have it curve off in the same way that health does. Which again, on paper that's fine, and it does solve the issue pretty handily, but also, something that does kind of stand out to me is, okay, that does create an irrelevancy in another area, which is, again, not as much of an issue, but the level of enemies themselves becomes much less relevant past a certain point, and there's much less incentive to, damage cap is this cool challenge that you can try and do, or level cap, excuse me, is something that's, this is a cool novelty challenge, that they can throw at you, or, makes the game exciting, it's like, okay, well now max level doesn't really mean anything anymore, because of how little stuff starts to scale past a certain point, because, like, with the way health is, enemy health is more or less the same at 180 as it is at level cap. Like, obviously they're going to be, like, noticeably more tanky, but not to the point where, if you're killing them at 180, you're probably killing them at level cap. Generally speaking. Which is something that has been really nice for me, and is really nice for builds as well. So you kind of have this idea of, okay, well, where is the cutoff of, this damage is overkill at this point, I don't need any more, I should probably invest in something else, like range or some other quality of life piece to the build. That is one thing I've very much enjoyed about health scaling off after a while. Also, I think another way that this can be somewhat remedied, at least, is rebalancing blue Archon shards. That is one that I've had in the back of my mind for a while, is that I think that they are a little bit underpowered. Like, I do use blue shards in a couple builds here and there, but generally speaking, it feels like some of the values are just a little bit weak. And it would be nice to see them buffed just a little bit, because one of the things that you have to consider is the balance of them compared to, red shards. It's opportunity cost. Is what are you giving up to have these blue shard benefits is what I think makes them not as desirable. Like, take the health regen one. Like, bump that up just a little bit. Maybe give, like, the flat values, since they are flat values, just a little bit more. and then having the art, you know, the Tau Forge multiplier bumping them up further still. Because generally speaking, considering how hard it is for the numbers of your health and shield and armor values to actually matter, I think it would be good to, you know, okay, well, make them worth considering, make them worthwhile. And I think Archon Shards would be a good place to supplement a lot of the health, armor, shield issues that a lot of Warframes tend to have. You know, if it's worth putting there, then that actually, again, allows, you know, more build flexibility without creating too high power ceilings, if you will. Because if the blue shards became worth slotting in, that realistically means that builds that weren't using them before and were just kind of relying on shield gating probably weren't adding, you know, survivability mods onto their build to begin with. So they're not really getting anything better out of it. They're not really getting more mod slots. In fact, they're probably technically losing something if they do want to spec into that, so I do think that it does create a much better opportunity cost for them.